Apples may not exist, and you may not either. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today we're talking about Mereological nihilism, which is the view that there are no composite objects. Instead, all objects are simple in that they lack proper parts. Mereology is the study of parts, wholes, and parthood relations, and nihilism about some domain says that entities in that domain don't exist. Moral nihilists, for instance, say that moral facts don't exist. Meaning nihilists say that there's no meaning or purpose in life. And Mereological nihilists say that composite objects don't exist. Now, Mereological nihilism may seem like a pretty radical view. It implies that there are no apples and oranges, no tables and chairs, no families and bookstores, no planets and galaxies. But these things seem perceptually obvious, don't they? Well, hang tight because we will get to that soon. Now, the most popular version of Mereological nihilism says that the only concrete objects that exist are super tiny fundamental simple particles, perhaps quarks and electrons, among others. But there are other versions of Mereological nihilism which take the fundamental simple objects to be, say, superstrings, or maybe quantum fields, or maybe even the universe itself. Now, that last view might sound crazy, since it would imply that the universe doesn't have parts, like planets and galaxies and trees and so on. Proponents of this version of Mereological nihilism typically argue that these alleged objects are actually just modes or aspects of the universe rather than things which compose the universe. But we're not going to get into that here. For present purposes, I'm just characterizing some of the Mereological nihilist views on offer. Again, the most popular version of Mereological nihilism says that the only concrete objects that exist are these simple fundamental particles. And going forward, I'm going to restrict my attention to this version of nihilism. Though note that the ensuing discussion could be cast in terms of other versions of Mereological nihilism without losing much substance. So before getting onto an argument for Mereological nihilism, I think we should ask, does the Mereological nihilist think that composite objects are just illusions or hallucinations? Do they think that our perception is just radically in error? Well, the answer is actually no. When we folk talk about tables and other purported composite objects, the nihilist invokes paraphrases and fictions that involve particles. Thus, when we say that there is a table, the nihilist holds that what really exists are particles arranged table-wise. And saying, there is a table, is just a convenient shorthand for this. Here, talk of the table is paraphrased via a plural term, particles, and a predicate that they satisfy, namely being arranged table-wise. The nihilist also typically holds that what we say about the table in ordinary life is true according to the fiction of composition, which is the quote-unquote fiction that the particles do indeed compose larger concrete objects like tables. The paraphrase and the fiction are complementary, in that the fiction is a useful heuristic, assertable in everyday life, for the more precise and technically accurate paraphrase. So the fiction of composition earns its keep by summarizing the often hideously complex arrangement of particles. For the nihilist, then, table talk is useful shorthand. This also helps explain why the Mereological nihilist isn't so much denying the appearances, but rather offering a different interpretation of them. We aren't hallucinating or subject to an illusion when we see an apple. It's just that what we're really seeing are particles arranged apple-wise, which reflect light in various ways, which eventually results in our experiences of redness and roundness and shininess and so on. Nihilism is not then a radical skeptical view. Reality is pretty much the way it appears. It's just that these appearances are interpreted in a way that might not occur to the ordinary person on the street. So, supposing that the aforementioned paraphrases and fictions work well enough, we might still wonder, why resort to all that? Like, why not just take folk discourse at face value and countenance apples and other composite objects as intuitively obvious and perceptually apparent? What could possibly motivate a view as seemingly out of line with common sense as Mereological nihilism? Well, there's actually a surprisingly large number of arguments for nihilism, and I'll point you guys to some excellent resources near the end of the video for more such arguments. But for now, I just want to present one prominent argument for nihilism called the explanatory exclusion argument. The argument begins by noting that in order to have an explanatorily sufficient ontology, or a list of what exists that suffices to explain everything about the world, particles are the only concrete objects needed. Thus, we have premise 1. Particles are the only concrete objects needed to explain how the world works and evolves. Somewhat more precisely, premise 1 says that the complete causal story of the world can be told in terms of the number, properties, and arrangement of mereologically simple particles, together with whatever laws of nature govern them. No composite objects like apples need to be mentioned in this story. They're entirely dispensable to the project of explaining the world. To take a toy example, consider a closed Newtonian atomistic system containing what we folk would describe as a rock shattering a window. The complete causal story here can be told purely in terms of the evolution of the Newtonian atoms through time, via their properties and relations as governed by Newtonian laws of mechanics. The rock and the window, as composite objects, need not actually be mentioned in our explanation. The particles alone can handle all the causal work. The argument then adds that recognizing composite concrete objects like apples in addition to the particles is recognizing what is either explanatorily redundant or epiphenomenal. Thus we get premise 2. If particles are the only concrete objects needed to explain how the world works and evolves, then if there were composite sums of particles, these composites would be explanatorily redundant or epiphenomenal entities. After all, if the particles are the only concrete objects needed to explain things as per premise 1, well then there's nothing left for the composites to explain. The composites can at best explain what the particles already suffice to explain. So if the composites, such as apples, explain anything at all, they're explanatorily redundant, while if they explain nothing at all, then they're all epiphenomenal. So if it's not already clear, to be explanatorily redundant is to explain something which is already sufficiently explained by something else. To be epiphenomenal, by contrast, is to play no explanatory or causal role whatsoever. It's basically just to float along for the ride, doing nothing, making no explanatory or causal difference to anything, basically contributing nothing, unlike my amazing patrons who contribute monthly donations and as a result receive lots of super cool goodies ranging from early access to exclusive access to videos and papers and more stuff besides. So, if you see value in the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Links to those in the description. Much love to all my existing patrons. So yes, my patrons are neither explanatorily redundant nor epiphenomenal, unlike composite objects if they were to exist, and if particles are the only concrete objects needed to explain how the world works and evolves. So this premise seems incredibly plausible, right? If particles really are the only concrete objects that we need to explain the world, then supposing that there are composite objects in addition to the particles, then if there really were composite objects in addition to the particles, well then they either do some explanatory work or not. If they do some explanatory work, well then, given that the particles already suffice to explain everything about the world, then they're just explaining something which is already sufficiently explained by something else, in which case they're explanatorily redundant. By contrast, if the composites do no explanatory work, well then they're just epiphenomenal entities. They're just kind of danglers. They don't play any causal or explanatory role whatsoever. So this premise seems to be on really good footing. The argument continues with a rejection of both explanatorily redundant and epiphenomenal entities, giving us premise 3, according to which there are no explanatorily redundant or epiphenomenal entities. Such a rejection is defended on methodological grounds. Occam's razor cuts against both explanatorily redundant and epiphenomenal entities, as there is no need to posit either of them. It would be like positing demons to cause climate change, even though greenhouse gases, which we already have in our ontology, suffice to explain it by themselves. If greenhouse gases already suffice to explain climate change, well then we shouldn't be positing demons to explain climate change in addition. Occam's razor cuts strongly against it. It's a posit that we just shouldn't make. Come to think of it, I imagine that some YouTube channels these days would be more than willing to postulate such demons causing climate change, but let's set that aside. Finally, from premises 1 through 3, the argument concludes that 4, there are no composite sums of particles. This conclusion delivers Mereological nihilism, at least granting that composite objects, if they existed, would be composites of particles. You and me and tables and planets and trees and galaxies and the universe, if any of these composite objects existed, they would be composite objects ultimately composed of particles. And so yeah, this conclusion delivers that there actually aren't any tables and apples and molecules and planets and galaxies or the universe or even people. Now, this conclusion might seem pretty implausible at first glance, but the argument is valid. In other words, the conclusion logically follows from the premises, and each premise might strike one as pretty plausible. And that, of course, is where you come in. What do you think of the argument? Do you accept Mereological nihilism? If not, which premise do you reject, and why? I'm curious to hear your thoughts, so leave those below. And of course, feel free to engage with others' answers too, but not in a toxic way, obviously. I know, big ask. Anyway, I'll close with 3 final points. First, many might be tempted to take a kind of Moorean response to the argument, pointing out that the negation of the conclusion just seems much more apparent than the conjunction of the premises. In other words, it just seems much more plausible that there are composite sums of particles than it is that all 3 of these premises are true. In which case, we should simply conclude that at least one of the premises is mistaken rather than reaching the nihilist conclusion. But it's at least worth noting that this Moorean response may not actually work. Oh, and Moorean, by the way, that just comes from G.E. Moore, right? We're talking about Moorean. G.E. Moore had a similar response to arguments for external world skepticism. But yeah, it's at least worth noting that this Moorean response might not actually work. Again, Mereological nihilism not only seems compatible with all our appearances, but also seems to predict them just as well as the view that there are composite objects. Where the opponent of Mereological nihilism posits an apple or any other ordinary object that is seemingly apparent in perception, the Mereological nihilist posits particles arranged apple-wise that lead to the exact same appearances. So both views seem not only compatible with all of our appearances, but both views seem to predict our experiences just as well. And if both views predict the appearances equally well, then the appearances don't seem to provide evidence for one over the other. So the appearances that allegedly favor rejecting the conclusion over accepting the premises may not actually be evidentially probative. There are, of course, lots of other objections to the argument. For instance, objections to the effect that there actually are explanatorily redundant or else epiphenomenal entities, or objections to the effect that the laws of nature, together with the arrangement, properties, and relations of particles, actually don't suffice to explain everything about the world, and more objections besides. But I simply want to cover the argument in this video and ask about your objections to it. So we won't be digging into these objections here beyond these passing comments that I just left. Oh, and fun fact, I got to see this handwritten letter from G.E. Moore himself on my prospective visit to MIT, and it was super dope. It's from October 24th, 1954, and it says, "Dear Mr. Thomson," and by the way, that's the person who invented the famous Thomson's lamp paradox, "thank you very much for sending me your paper on supertasks. It has interested me extremely, and I think you have solved one of my struggles. Yours sincerely, G.E. Moore." The second closing point is that there are many other arguments for and objections to Mereological nihilism beyond those presented in this video. For example, there's the problem of the many and Sorites arguments, both of which I covered in my videos here, and lots of other arguments too. You can see among many other resources Kane B's video on the topic here, 4 SEP entries on the problem of the many, ordinary objects, material constitution, the Sorites paradox, and finally Dustin Crummett's popular presentation and defense of Mereological nihilism here. All of this stuff is linked in the description. Third and finally, note that in some videos I'm in persuasive mode, whereas in others I'm in expository mode. This video is in expository mode. I'm just trying to exposit Mereological nihilism and one of the prominent arguments for it. I'm not saying here that I accept the view or that this argument succeeds, and nor am I trying to persuade you to accept the view. Instead, I'm presenting the argument and really just posing the question to you. What do you think? Does the argument work? Do apples exist? Again, let me know in the comment section down below. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please smash that like button, share it with your friends and neighbors and grandparents, turn on that little bell for notifications so you know when my videos come out, consider supporting me on Patreon or through a one-time donation. Much love to all my existing patrons, and what better way to end is there than, I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.